The first thing he noticed wasn't the guards. It wasn't the barbed wire. It wasn't even the American flag snapping in the wind. It was the light. A Japanese naval officer stood at the edge of the transport yard in California, hands folded behind his back, posture still rigid from habit. Night had already fallen. In Japan, night meant darkness, blacked-out windows, lamps dimmed to pinpricks, cities holding their breath. But here, the darkness never arrived. Floodlights washed over warehouses like artificial daylight. Streets beyond the fence glowed softly, not harsh, not military, just normal. Trucks rolled past without headlights dimmed. Somewhere in the distance, music leaked from a radio. Laughter, casual and unafraid, drifted through the air. In his pocket was a small notebook. He took it out slowly, glancing once at the guard, then looked back at the lights and wrote a single line. No nation fighting for survival would waste electricity like this. He paused, pen hovering, unless it wasn't waste. Back home, he had been told America was hollow, a country addicted to comfort, too soft for sacrifice, too divided to endure a long war. The briefings had been confident, almost dismissive. Strike hard, strike fast, and the Americans would fold. Their factories would stall, their people would complain, their will would crack. That belief had made the war feel winnable. Now, standing under a sky that refused to go dark, something didn't add up. He watched a group of American workers walk past the fence. No uniforms, no urgency, leather jackets, rolled sleeves. One of them carried a paper bag, grease already soaking through the bottom. Another tossed an empty bottle into a bin without looking. They moved like men who expected tomorrow to arrive, and expected it to be better than today. The officer felt an unfamiliar tightening in his chest. Propaganda had taught him to fear American brutality. What unsettled him now was American normalcy. If this was how they lived while fighting a global war, what did their factories look like? What did their ports look like? What did their war really run on? He closed the notebook. At that moment, he still believed this brightness was an illusion, a performance staged for prisoners, a thin mask stretched over a fragile system. He did not yet understand the truth. This light wasn't a show. It was a warning, and it was only the beginning. Before the war, the assumption felt airtight. In Tokyo, in rooms lined with maps and incense-thin cigarette smoke, American weakness wasn't debated. It was accepted. Reports described a nation obsessed with comfort, labor unions that argued instead of obeyed, citizens who demanded refrigerators and cars instead of discipline and sacrifice, a people too soft, too divided, too distracted to survive a long, grinding war. One senior planner had scribbled a note in the margin of a briefing paper. They lack spiritual endurance. It was repeated so often it stopped sounding like an opinion and started sounding like physics. The Japanese military didn't underestimate America's wealth. They underestimated what that wealth meant. They believed abundance made men fragile, that factories built for comfort couldn't be converted to war, that people who lived well would panic when that life was threatened. And for a while, the theory seemed to work. Pearl Harbor burned, battleships sank, headlines screamed, the Pacific reeled. In the first months, the shock looked decisive. In some offices, there were quiet nods of satisfaction. The tiger paper analogy seemed proven. But what no one in those rooms had ever seen, not firsthand, was how America behaved after being hit. Not the speeches, not the posters, the response beneath all of that. Across the ocean, something else was happening. Men who had been building cars were suddenly building bombers. Factories that once shut down at dusk turned their lights back on. and didn't turn them off again. Women stepped onto assembly lines without waiting to be asked, not because they were ordered to, because there was work to be done. Back in Japan, intelligence summaries lagged weeks behind reality. Numbers were underestimated, speeds miscalculated, output softened in translation, and every small error leaned in the same direction, toward comfort, slowness, fragility. The Japanese command believed they were racing a tired giant. They didn't realize the giant hadn't even stood up yet. And when it did, it didn't roar. It worked, quietly, relentlessly, and faster than anyone had imagined. They first heard the number and laughed. 4 days, that was how long it took, the American guide said casually, to build one of these ships. Not a patrol boat, not a barge, a full ocean-going cargo vessel. Steel hull, engines mounted, ready to sail. 4 days. The Japanese officer standing on the catwalk above the yard didn't react at first. He assumed there had been a translation error, or exaggeration. Americans were known, even in enemy briefings, for bravado. So he leaned forward, looked down. Below him, a Liberty ship slid into the water with a groan of metal and a roar of cheers. Workers clapped, wiped their hands on oil-stained trousers, and immediately turned back to the next hull, already taking shape beside it. No ceremony, no reverence, no pause, just continuation. In Japan, ships were built like swords, carefully, precisely, slowly, each one a statement of national pride, months of work, sometimes more. Here, ships were treated like cans rolling off a line, disposable, replaceable, weaponized in their quantity, not their beauty. The officer scanned the yard, eyes moving from crane to crane, trying to count. Hulls at different stages, steel plates stacked like firewood, rails feeding parts forward in an endless mechanical appetite, men shouting measurements, not orders. No barking discipline, no bowed heads, and yet everything moved. On his notepad, his handwriting tightened. "This is not craftsmanship," he wrote. "This is multiplication." Only later would he understand why that mattered. Because in war, ships sink, always. Mines, submarines, storms, loss is inevitable. Japan had built a strategy around preservation, protect the fleet, avoid waste, guard every asset as if it were irreplaceable. America had built something else entirely, a system that assumed loss and made it irrelevant. The guide pointed toward the horizon where another Liberty ship was already shrinking into the distance. "If that one goes down," he said, almost kindly, "there'll be another behind it." The officer didn't answer. He was too busy doing the math and realizing for the first time that this war might not be decided by who fought better, but by who could afford to lose more. He closed the notebook. Something cold settled in his stomach. This wasn't American excess. This was American design, and it changed everything. The factory floor should have gone quiet at dusk. That was how it worked back home. Whistles blew, machines slowed, men wiped their hands and stepped away. Even in wartime, there were limits to how long steel and flesh could be pushed before something broke. So when the Japanese officer returned the next morning and found the same machines still running, he assumed he had misread the time. He checked the clock on the wall, then his watch. The hands confirmed what his eyes already knew. The factory had never stopped. Steam still hung in the air, warm and metallic. Conveyor belts crept forward with the same unhurried confidence they'd had the day before. New faces had replaced the old ones at each station. Women, older men, boys barely past high school. But the rhythm was identical. No pause, no reset, just continuity. The officer stood with his arms folded, watching a wing section slide into position. There was a flaw in one of the rivet lines. In Japan, that would have meant a halt. Inspection, correction, ceremony. Here, a foreman stepped in, shouted a number, and the line kept moving. 2 workers adjusted on the fly, their motions practiced, almost bored. The flaw vanished before the next section arrived. No apology, no delay. What unsettled him wasn't the speed anymore. It was the indifference. America wasn't rushing. It wasn't straining. It wasn't sacrificing quality for haste. It was operating as if time itself had been bent to its will. He noticed the clock again. Shift change happened without ceremony. One set of hands lifted away, another slid into place. Machines never noticed. The war never noticed. In a corner, a chalkboard listed output goals. They weren't inspirational slogans, just numbers, clean, brutal, met every day. Back home, sacrifice was visible. You felt it in hunger, in exhaustion, in the silence of cities at night. Here, sacrifice was hidden inside systems. The officer felt a flicker of something dangerously close to admiration, and crushed it immediately. This wasn't courage, he told himself. It was decadence wearing efficiency's mask. But the thought didn't stick, because decadence collapses under pressure. This didn't. As they left the floor, the guide mentioned something in passing, almost as an afterthought. "Tomorrow," he said, "you'll see the aircraft plant." The officer nodded politely. Then alone, he wrote one more line in his notebook. If this is how they build machines, what do they do with men? The first night in the camp, he couldn't sleep. Not because of fear, not because of hunger, because the world outside refused to go dark. From his bunk, he could see beyond the fence, past the watchtower, past the gravel road, into a neighborhood that should not have existed in wartime. Streetlights hummed softly. Porch lights glowed behind curtains. Windows stayed lit deep into the night, silhouettes moving inside as if nothing extraordinary were happening at all. In Japan, darkness had become a discipline. Cities dimmed themselves like obedient soldiers. Electricity was rationed. Curtains were thick. Even cigarettes were cupped in hands, so their embers wouldn't betray a position from the air. Darkness meant loyalty. Here, darkness seemed optional. The officer sat up slowly, careful not to wake the others, and watched a boy ride past on a bicycle, the chrome catching light as he pedaled. Somewhere, a radio played. Not martial music, something light, almost careless. He frowned. This was a nation at war. Thousands of miles away, their ships were being sunk. Their sons were dying in jungles and at sea. And yet, here were children playing after sunset, as if the war were a rumor instead of a reality. The explanation offered in the briefings came back to him. They are ignorant, he had been told, distracted, unserious. But ignorance didn't explain the infrastructure. Distracted nations didn't pour concrete this smoothly or wire entire suburbs to stay awake through the night. Unserious people didn't build factories that never slept. He noticed something else then. The guards weren't tense. They leaned against the fence, talked quietly. One of them laughed at a joke he couldn't hear. Another sipped coffee from a dented mug, steam rising lazily into the cool air. No urgency, no fear of imminent collapse. This wasn't denial, it was confidence. For the first time, a disturbing thought crept in, uninvited. Maybe America wasn't conserving because it didn't need to. Maybe restraint wasn't a virtue when abundance was real. He lay back down, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint buzz of electricity bleeding through the walls. In the darkness of the barracks, surrounded by men raised to believe suffering was strength. He felt something shift. If this country could afford light like this, what else could it afford to lose? And what would it take to stop it? The tray stopped in front of him with a dull scrape. He looked down, expecting the usual wartime rations. Thin soup, rice stretched too far, something eaten more out of obligation than hunger. Instead there was bread, white bread, soft, thick, still warm enough to leave a faint cloud of steam when torn open. Beside it sat a slab of meat tucked into a bun, juices soaking into the paper below. A slice of pickle, a small cup filled with something dark and bubbling. He didn't touch it. Around him, other prisoners hesitated too. Men raised on discipline and scarcity stared at the food as if it were a test. Some glanced at the guards, waiting for a punchline that never came. "Eat," one of the guards said, not unkindly. The officer lifted the bread slowly, brought it close and smelled it. It didn't smell like survival. It smelled like routine. He took a bite. The texture alone was disorienting. No grit, no compromise. Meat that hadn't been shaved thin to make it last. Fat left intact, unapologetic. He chewed carefully, eyes down, as if hiding the act might preserve his dignity. Across the table, a younger prisoner laughed once, short, sharp, then stopped himself, embarrassed by the sound. Another man wiped grease from his fingers and stared at them afterward, as if they belonged to someone else. Later that afternoon, crates appeared. Glass bottles, brown, cold to the touch, Coca-Cola, not for officers, not for visitors, for them. He watched one man lift the bottle, study the label, then tip it back with a cautious sip. His eyes widened before he could stop them. Sugar, carbonation, excess. The officer didn't drink his right away. He held it, felt the chill against his palm, and realized something that made his stomach tighten more than hunger ever had. This wasn't generosity. This was normal. America wasn't feeding them well to make a point. It wasn't trying to humiliate them with abundance. This was simply how Americans ate, even while fighting a global war. Back home, civilians tightened belts so soldiers could eat. Here, soldiers and prisoners ate the same. He set the bottle down untouched. If a country could afford to feed its enemies like this, what kind of reserves did it keep for itself? And more unsettling still, what did it say about a war that hadn't yet forced America to choose? They thought the food was the limit, that whatever point America was trying to make, it had already been made. Bread, meat, sugar, comfort disguised as routine. Enough to confuse, enough to unsettle, but still explainable. Even enemies sometimes ate well, after all. Then came the ice cream. It arrived without announcement, pushed on a cart by a young serviceman who looked barely old enough to shave. Metal lids clinked softly as he lifted them, releasing a pale cloud of cold into the warm afternoon air. Inside were tubs packed with something white and impossibly smooth. A prisoner scoffed under his breath. Another shook his head slowly, as if refusing to process what he was seeing. Ice cream was not food. Ice cream was celebration. In Japan, cold was a resource. Ice was rationed, saved, guarded. Here it was being spent, not on the wounded, not on officers, but on prisoners of war, in the middle of a conflict that spanned half the planet. The officer watched a man accept a bowl. His hands trembled slightly as he took the spoon. He tasted it, paused, then laughed, not with joy, but with disbelief so sharp it almost sounded like pain. Someone muttered a curse. Someone else looked away. The officer didn't eat his. He watched it melt instead, a thin ring of white spreading along the metal bowl. Melt meant time. Cold meant energy. Energy meant surplus. This wasn't kindness. It wasn't psychological warfare. It was indifference to scarcity. America could afford to let ice cream melt in the sun while fighting Japan and Germany at the same time. That realization landed heavier than any insult. He remembered lectures about moral superiority, about how restraint forged strength, about how excess weakened nations from the inside out. And yet here stood a country drowning in excess, not collapsing, not panicking, not even straining, thriving. A guard noticed his untouched bowl and shrugged. "Suit yourself," he said, pushing the cart onward. The officer stared at the thinning puddle long after it was gone. For the first time since his capture, anger flared. Not at the guards, not at America, but at the certainty he'd once carried so proudly. If abundance was supposed to rot a nation, why did this one feel so terrifyingly stable? And if this was what they were willing to waste, what were they willing to unleash? The infirmary smelled wrong, too clean, too calm. The officer noticed it the moment he stepped inside. The sharp edge of antiseptic, the quiet efficiency of motion, the absence of shouting. In Japan, field hospitals were places of urgency and pain. You smelled blood before you saw it. You heard suffering long before anyone spoke to you. Here, voices were low, measured, almost gentle. A wounded prisoner lay on a narrow bed, his leg elevated, bandages white, instead of the dull gray the officer was used to. A young American medic leaned in close, speaking slowly, his tone patient, as if addressing a child or an old friend. The prisoner nodded, confused more than afraid. Then came the needle. The officer stiffened, expecting the man on the bed to flinch, to cry out. Instead, the prisoner exhaled. His shoulders dropped. Pain, real pain, drained from his face in seconds. Penicillin. The word had circulated in whispers. A miracle drug. Rare. Too valuable for ordinary soldiers, let alone enemies. Back home, men died from infections that would have been trivial here. And yet the medic didn't hesitate. No debate, no weighing of worth, enemy or not. The protocol was the same. The officer's jaw tightened as he watched the medic clean his hands again, methodical, almost bored by the act of saving a life. This wasn't charity. This wasn't moral theater. It was systematized mercy. On a nearby table sat textbooks, English manuals, medical guides, open, unlocked, as if knowledge itself wasn't something to be guarded. One of the prisoners asked a question in broken English. The medic answered, slowly, drawing a diagram on scrap paper. The officer caught himself staring at their hands. One steady, one shaking, meeting in a space that propaganda had promised would be filled with cruelty. He turned away, because this was harder to process than ice cream or bread or light. Machines could be explained. Abundance could be rationalized. But this required admitting something unbearable. That America wasn't just winning with steel and oil and speed. It was fighting with a different idea of human value. And once that thought entered his mind, it refused to leave. The books arrived without ceremony. No announcement, no warning. Just a stack, placed on a wooden table near the barracks. Their covers already worn, their pages soft from other hands. Newspapers sat on top, folded neatly, dated only days old. American newspapers. At first no one touched them. In Japan, information was controlled with the same discipline as food. Words were rationed. Truth came filtered, polished, safe. An enemy's press, uncensored and fresh, felt dangerous, like stepping onto thin ice without knowing how thick it was. The officer watched from a distance as one man approached the table. He pretended to adjust his sleeve, then let his fingers brush the edge of a paper. He didn't take it. Not yet. He glanced around, as if expecting to be stopped. No one did. Later that night, the officer found a newspaper tucked beneath his mattress. He hadn't put it there. Someone else had slipped it in quietly, almost apologetically. He unfolded it with care, half expecting a trap. What he found instead was chaos. Arguments printed openly, criticism of government decisions, casual mentions of setbacks, losses, debates in Congress, no triumphal language, no enforced optimism. Just a nation talking to itself in public, disagreeing loudly while continuing to function. It made his head ache. He read slowly, stopping often, translating phrases in his mind. This wasn't propaganda. It was messier than that. Too self-critical, too transparent. And yet, the factories kept running. The lights stayed on. The ice cream still came. He began to notice others doing the same. Men sitting with books, open, eyes narrowed, lips moving silently as they traced unfamiliar sentences. Conversations changed. Less shouting, fewer absolutes, more pauses. No one announced a change of heart. It happened in the small things. A man asked for an English dictionary. Another requested a history book. Someone stopped arguing about destiny and started asking how American elections worked. Not out of admiration, out of confusion. The officer closed the paper and stared at the ceiling. Back home, certainty had been a weapon. Here, doubt seemed harmless, and somehow stronger. For the first time he wondered if belief itself could be dismantled without force, without humiliation, without a single order being given, just by letting people look. The first time they mentioned radar, the officer dismissed it. He had heard the word before, vague, almost mythical, a device that could see without eyes. Useful, perhaps, but impractical at scale. Something experimental, fragile, certainly not something you wasted on cargo ships. Then he saw the diagram. It was pinned casually to a board during a briefing meant for camp administration, not prisoners. An American officer spoke without drama, tracing lines across the paper as if explaining plumbing, antennae, pulses, reflections, range. What caught the Japanese officer's attention wasn't the complexity, it was the placement. Radar on merchant vessels, not cruisers, not destroyers, freighters, ships whose only job was to carry food, fuel, and steel across oceans crawling with submarines. In Japanese doctrine, sensors were precious, limited, guarded. You equipped elite units and hoped they survived long enough to matter. Here, America treated detection like insulation, something every structure deserved by default. The officer leaned closer, heart sinking. If a cargo ship could see a submarine before it struck, the submarine lost its greatest weapon: surprise. That night, he replayed naval engagements in his mind. Reports once chalked up to bad luck, convoys that slipped through traps, U-boats that vanished without explanation, attacks that failed despite perfect positioning. They hadn't been unlucky, they'd been seen. The next blow came quietly. A former engineer among the prisoners confirmed it, almost reluctantly. Radar wasn't rare. It was standardized, mass-produced, simplified, so crews with minimal training could use it effectively. America had turned perception itself into an assembly line product. The officer's hands curled into fists. This wasn't bravery versus cowardice, not skill versus incompetence. This was asymmetry so severe it felt obscene. One side still fought with eyes and ears. The other had given ships a sixth sense, and suddenly the ocean felt very small. He wrote nothing in his notebook that night. Some truths were too heavy to trap on paper. If America could industrialize awareness itself, what chance did courage ever really have? They didn't explain it at first. The officer only heard fragments. A word here, a number there, passed between guards who assumed no one around them understood English well enough to care. Something about a new fuse, something about airbursts, something about rounds detonating near a target instead of on impact. He dismissed it as exaggeration. Artillery had rules. Shells flew. They hit or they missed. Accuracy depended on aim, range, wind, on the skill of the men behind the gun. That was how it had always been. Then a report circulated, a battle summary, translated roughly, pinned to a notice board by mistake, and removed too late. Anti-aircraft fire that didn't chase planes anymore. It waited for them. Shells that didn't need to touch metal to kill pilots. Explosions blossoming in the air itself, tearing through formations that should have slipped past untouched. The proximity fuse, a shell with judgment. Inside it, the Americans had placed a tiny radar, small enough to survive launch, smart enough to sense distance, cruel enough to decide when to explode, not when it hit, when it got close enough. The officer felt a chill spread along his spine. In Japanese doctrine, gunners trained for years to calculate lead and elevation. Precision was honor. Misses were shame. Now the shell itself corrected for human limitation. Aim became optional. Skill became secondary. The sky, once a vast refuge, shrank into a lethal envelope. He imagined a pilot climbing, trusting altitude, only to see nothing, no tracer, no warning, before the air itself erupted beside his wing. No duel, no contest, just absence, followed by fire. What unsettled him most wasn't the lethality. It was the philosophy behind it. America had decided that relying on human excellence was inefficient, that war should not depend on perfect men. It should depend on systems that worked even when men were tired, frightened, or average. Back home, heroes were trained. Here, failure was engineered out. The officer closed his eyes and pictured the future battlefield. Not warriors testing themselves against fate, but targets moving through invisible grids, judged and eliminated by machines that never doubted. He opened his notebook, hesitated, then wrote only this: "They have removed mercy from chance." And with that realization, something ancient cracked. They described it like a rumor at first. A pipe, under the ocean. The officer heard it from another prisoner, a former logistics planner, who spoke in a low voice as if afraid the idea itself might be contagious. Oil, he said. Fuel flowing from England to the continent without ships, without tankers, without convoys to sink. The officer almost laughed. Oceans were barriers. Everyone knew that. Water broke supply lines. It always had. Every navy in history had been built around that assumption. You moved fuel by ship, and ships could be hunted. That was the rule. Then he saw the photograph. A grainy image slipped between pages of a technical journal, printed so casually it felt obscene. A reel the size of a building, steel pipe wound like thread, engineers standing beside it, smiling faintly, as if posing next to a bridge or a dam. Pluto, the caption read, "Pipeline under the ocean." It wasn't elegant. It wasn't heroic. It was brute logic applied at an impossible scale. The Americans hadn't tried to protect tankers better. They had removed tankers from the equation. The officer stared at the image, his mind working through the implications. Fuel moving continuously, invisibly, immune to submarines, immune to weather, immune to interdiction. Armies advancing not on what could be delivered tomorrow, but on what never stopped arriving. He thought of Japanese supply lines, fragile, stretched, dependent on timing and luck. Of pilots grounded because fuel didn't arrive, of ships sunk carrying everything needed for an offensive that would now never happen. And here was a country that looked at the same problem and refused to accept its limits. They didn't ask whether it was reasonable. They asked whether it could be engineered. The realization landed slowly, but with crushing weight. This wasn't improvisation. It wasn't desperation. It was premeditated inevitability. America didn't just fight battles. It redesigned the environment those battles existed in. The officer folded the paper carefully, as if rough handling might break something sacred or profane. He couldn't tell which anymore. If the ocean itself could be turned into infrastructure, what sanctuary was left? The man wiping grease from his hands didn't look like a warrior. He was broad, yes, thick through the shoulders, heavy in the arms, but there was no sharpness to him, no tension. He leaned against the railing of the factory floor as if waiting for a streetcar, chewing slowly, eyes half-lidded with something close to boredom. The Japanese officer noticed the lunch pail first. Metal. Dent in the side, still warm. Inside was meat. Not shaved thin, not stretched. A slab. Pink in the middle. Fat left on. The kind of meal reserved back home for festivals or officers, not men who stood at machines for 10 hours at a stretch. The worker took a bite, chewed, swallowed, then stepped back to his station and lifted a steel panel with one hand. The officer watched, unsettled. In Japan, factory laborers were lean, efficient, quiet. Their strength came from discipline, not abundance. Hunger was worn like a badge of seriousness. To suffer was to contribute. Here, suffering wasn't visible. These men didn't look like they were being driven. They looked like they belonged here. Leather aprons creaked as they moved. Gloves were thick, replaced when worn. Machines were adjusted to suit bodies, not the other way around. And the output numbers didn't slow. A foreman walked past, not shouting, not inspecting, just checking boxes on a clipboard. When a machine jammed, it was cleared in seconds. No drama, no reprimand. The line absorbed the delay and moved on. The officer felt a familiar instinct rise, to dismiss it as softness. But the math betrayed that instinct. Well-fed men lifted more, worked longer, made fewer mistakes, didn't collapse when pushed, didn't need to be coerced into effort. America wasn't extracting labor, it was sustaining it. For the first time, the officer saw the American worker not as a civilian behind the lines, but as a component of a weapon system, one designed to operate indefinitely without breaking. Back home, men were expected to endure until they were spent. Here, men were maintained. He looked down at his own hands, thinner now, veins visible, and felt something close to resentment. If this was decadence, why did it feel so brutally effective? And if this was the foundation of American power, how long could anyone hope to fight it? They burned it, not in panic, not in retreat, deliberately. The officer first heard the story from a guard who mentioned it the way one might mention bad weather. A fuel depot captured, then destroyed. Tens of thousands of gallons, poured out, ignited, reduced to flame and smoke, so thick it blotted out the sky. "Why not use it?" someone asked. The guard shrugged. Didn't need it. That answer stayed with the officer longer than any statistic. Back home, fuel was sacred, every drop accounted for. Pilots trained, knowing a single missed shipment, could ground an entire squadron. Convoys were planned like rituals, each one a fragile thread holding the war together. Here, fuel could be sacrificed, not because it was worthless, but because it was replaceable. The officer later saw photographs, night shots, columns of fire roaring upward, reflected in the faces of American engineers standing at a safe distance, hands on hips, watching their own resources burn. No urgency, no grief, just calculation. Destroy now, rebuild later. The logic was chilling. Japan had built a strategy around preservation. Protect what you have, because you may never get it again. America had built one around regeneration. Lose it today, or replace it tomorrow, twice as large. He imagined the supply officers back home, sweating over ledgers, stretching inventories, praying ships would make it through. Then he imagined this, a nation so certain of its production that it could deny itself resources simply to deny them to the enemy. This wasn't waste, it was dominance expressed as choice. The officer felt a quiet dread settle in. You could outfight an enemy who conserved. You could outmaneuver an enemy who rationed. But how did you fight one who could afford to destroy its own strength without flinching? As the flames rose in those photographs, he realized something that made his chest tighten. This war was no longer about territory, or honor, or even victory. It was about which system could afford to exist longer than the other, and only one of them seemed designed to survive its own losses. The reports from Bastogne arrived thin, almost apologetic. They didn't read like accounts of a great battle, no sweeping maneuvers. No glorious charges, just fragments, cold, snow, American units surrounded, cut off, low on supplies. On paper, it looked like the kind of moment Japanese doctrine had been built for. An enemy pushed past its limits, ready to break. And yet, the line didn't break. The officer read the translated summaries slowly, tracing each sentence as if hidden meaning might appear between the words. German forces had encircled the town, weather-grounded aircraft. Roads were choked. The situation should have ended decisively. Instead, the Americans held. What unsettled him wasn't their courage. Every army had courage when cornered. What unsettled him was how little the situation seemed to matter. Supplies appeared anyway, dropped from the sky with a precision that ignored cloud cover and enemy fire. Artillery responded faster than expected. Striking targets that should have been invisible, units moved as if guided by something beyond sight or sound. The officer noticed a phrase repeated more than once. Fire direction center, coordinates relayed, calculations centralized, guns adjusted without seeing what they were killing. Back home, battles were felt. You heard them, smelled them, you fought what you could reach. Here, battle had become abstract. Men on the ground were no longer making desperate choices in isolation. They were nodes in a system that corrected for fear, fatigue, even bad weather. When one part strained, another compensated. The officer leaned back, exhaling slowly. Bastogne wasn't a miracle. It was a demonstration. America didn't need perfect conditions. It didn't need heroic timing. Its system absorbed chaos and returned structure. Where another army would have collapsed inward, this one redistributed pressure until nothing snapped. He imagined facing that as an enemy, throwing everything forward, watching it disappear into a machine that simply recalculated and continued. For the first time, he understood the real imbalance. This wasn't a war between nations. It was a war between systems. And one of them didn't care how bad things got. It had been built for that. The pilots used to talk about the sky as if it were honest, wide, neutral, a place where skill still mattered, where a good eye, steady hands, and courage could bend fate just enough to survive another day. In Japan, in Germany, in every air force that still believed in the romance of flight, the sky was the last arena where a man could prove himself. Then the Americans changed it. The officer didn't witness it directly. He felt it through the way the conversations shifted, through the silences that followed certain reports, through the way men stopped arguing about tactics and started asking quieter questions. Why were planes being intercepted before they were seen? Why did formations dissolve without ever finding the enemy? Why did bad weather suddenly stop protecting anyone? Radar-guided fighters, ground-controlled interception, voices on the radio telling pilots where to turn, when to climb, when to fire. Before instinct even had time to speak, the sky was no longer empty. It had been mapped, measured, watched. A former pilot among the prisoners described it one evening, staring at his hands as if they no longer belonged to him. He spoke of flying toward a target that should have been invisible, only to realize too late that someone on the ground had been tracking him for minutes, that the enemy already knew his speed, his altitude, his fuel state. He hadn't been hunted by another man. He'd been processed. The officer felt something old and fragile give way inside him. For generations, warrior cultures had believed that excellence could overcome disadvantage, that mastery of self could offset weakness in tools. America had removed that equation. Skill still mattered, but only inside boundaries set by machines. Courage still existed, but it no longer changed outcomes. The system decided first. The man followed, if he was still alive. The sky, once infinite, had become a grid, and in that grid, the advantage no longer belonged to the brave, but to the side that saw first, calculated faster, and never tired. The officer closed his eyes. If even the sky could be owned like this, what was left for belief to stand on? The breaking point didn't arrive with an explosion. It came in a moment so ordinary it almost escaped notice. A crate had been opened near the camp kitchen. Inside were cuts of meat, more than could be cooked that day. A cook glanced at it, did some quick math in his head, then waved it away. Too much. It would spoil before it was needed. So they dumped it. The officer watched from a few steps back as slabs slid into a metal bin. Perfectly edible, still cold, still red. The lid closed. End of decision. No ceremony, no guilt, no discussion. Something in his chest tightened, sharp and unfamiliar. Back home, meat was memory. Scarcity taught men to remember every meal. Every bite was counted against tomorrow's hunger. Waste wasn't immoral. It was unthinkable. Here, it was logistical. The officer stood very still, hands clenched behind his back, eyes fixed on the bin as if it might reopen and reveal a mistake. It didn't. That night, he took out his notebook. He stared at the page for a long time before writing. When the words finally came, they were smaller than usual, pressed tight, as if ashamed to exist. "We believed abundance would weaken them," he wrote. "It has freed them." He stopped, crossed out nothing, added another line. "We trained men to endure suffering. They trained systems to eliminate it." Around him, the barracks were quiet, not the tense quiet of fear, a deeper one. Men lay awake without speaking. No whispered arguments about destiny, no talk of final victories, just the soft sounds of breathing. The occasional shift of weight on a mattress, belief, once so loud, had begun to retreat. The officer realized with a jolt that something irreversible had happened, not to the war, to the way he understood the world. If a nation could discard resources like this, not from cruelty, but from confidence, then the assumptions that had guided his life were no longer reliable. He closed the notebook and slid it back under his pillow. This wasn't defeat. It was worse. It was the beginning of doubt. The arguments stopped first. Not all at once, not dramatically. They simply thinned out, like smoke losing its source. Where men once debated strategy and destiny in low, heated voices, there were now long stretches of nothing at all. Silence settled into the barracks. The officer noticed it during evening roll call. Faces still answered. Posture remained correct, but eyes no longer searched for agreement. No one tried to convince anyone of anything anymore. Pride had run out of words. He saw it in the small behaviors. Men who once corrected each other's posture now looked away. Those who had argued fiercely about honor and sacrifice stopped finishing their sentences. Conversations drifted and died without resolution. One night, a prisoner asked a guard for a book. Not a novel, not propaganda, an English grammar guide. The request was made quietly, almost embarrassed. The guard nodded and returned later with a thin volume. No comment, no suspicion. Others followed: a dictionary, a history textbook, a newspaper subscription. Not to praise America, not to imitate it, but to understand it. The officer watched men trace unfamiliar words with their fingers, lips moving silently as they practiced sounds they never thought they would need. He saw them hesitate before asking questions, not because they were afraid of punishment, but because asking meant admitting something had changed. No one spoke about Japan anymore. No speeches, no slogans, no vows of final resistance. What replaced them was worse: a quiet reckoning. Letters home went unwritten, or written and torn up. How did one explain a world that no longer fit the values those letters were supposed to defend? The officer sat on his bunk one evening, listening to the hum of electricity beyond the walls, and realized that pride hadn't been crushed. It had been rendered irrelevant, not by humiliation, not by force, but by exposure. When belief meets a reality it cannot dominate or deny, it doesn't explode, it dissolves. And in that dissolution, something colder begins to take its place. The shame didn't come from defeat, it came from comparison. The officer felt it one afternoon while watching a group of American soldiers repair a truck near the fence. The work was clumsy at first. A dropped wrench, a laugh, someone wiping grease onto his uniform without concern. Nothing impressive, nothing disciplined, and yet within minutes, the engine roared back to life. No shouting, no hierarchy on display. One man suggested something, another tried it, a third corrected him. The problem disappeared, absorbed by cooperation so casual it barely registered as effort. The officer looked away, because somewhere deep inside, admiration had taken root, and it terrified him. He had been taught that respect for the enemy was a form of weakness. That to see value in another system was to betray one's own. Yet now, without meaning to, he found himself measuring everything against what he had seen here. Efficiency without fear, authority without ritual, strength without suffering. That night, he wrote again. "I understand them now," he began. He stopped. The sentence felt like treason. He tore the page out, folded it carefully, then unfolded it and smoothed it again, as if the paper itself deserved an apology. Finally, he rewrote the thought in smaller words, safer words. "They are not what we were told." Around him, other men carried the same burden in silence. No one said it aloud, but the signs were everywhere. The way eyes lingered on American newspapers, the way arguments about superiority ended before they began, the way men flinched, not at guards, but at their own thoughts. Admiration once felt does not stay neutral. It demands an answer. Either you reject it violently, or you turn it inward and ask what it says about you. The officer felt the weight of that question settle heavily on his chest. If this enemy was not decadent, not weak, not collapsing, then what exactly had he given his life to fight? And if the answer was wrong, what did that make him? He lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady hum of a system that did not need his belief to function. Tomorrow, he knew, would be worse, because admiration had already crossed the line, and it was becoming something else. The surrender didn't sound like surrender. There were no declarations, no raised voices, no moment where someone stood and said the old beliefs were wrong. That kind of collapse belonged to stories, not to men who had spent their lives learning how to endure. This one happened quietly. The officer noticed it when a guard made an offhand comment about the war ending someday, not soon, not as a threat, just a fact, spoken the way one talks about winter coming. No one reacted. Months earlier, such a remark would have sparked anger, denial, speeches about destiny and resolve. Now it passed through the room like air. Unchallenged, unanswered, belief had stopped defending itself. He saw it in the way men listened. They no longer leaned forward when news arrived, no longer searched reports for proof that the enemy was weakening. Losses were read without excuses. Victories were acknowledged without celebration. Reality no longer needed interpretation. One evening, the officer found himself explaining something to a younger prisoner, not just translating words, but clarifying how American command worked, how decisions flowed, how production fed strategy, how the system corrected itself when it failed. Halfway through, he stopped speaking. He realized he was no longer describing the enemy. He was describing a model. The younger man nodded slowly, not with enthusiasm, but with resignation, as if something he had feared was now undeniable. Later that night, the officer sat alone, hands resting on his knees, posture finally slack. He felt no rage, no despair, just a deep, hollow stillness. The war he had imagined was gone, not lost, dissolved. What remained was the knowledge that the conflict had never been fair in the way he had been taught to understand fairness. That bravery and suffering, however real, had been placed inside a contest they could never decide. America hadn't defeated them by proving them weak. It had defeated them by proving its own assumptions stronger. The officer closed his eyes. This was not humiliation. It was surrender without spectacle, and it was complete. The train moved slowly, almost politely, as it carried them inland. No chains, no shouting, just the steady rhythm of steel on rail, a sound so even it felt unreal after years of explosions and alarms. The officer sat by the window, hands resting on his knees, watching America pass by in fragments. Fields, towns, factories set back from the tracks, their chimneys breathing without urgency. People waved, not to him specifically, just waved, at the train, at the idea of movement. He watched a farmhouse slip past, light spilling from its windows though the sun was still hours from setting. Somewhere, a radio played. Somewhere else, a child ran alongside the tracks for a few seconds, laughing, before falling behind. The notebook lay open in his lap. He hadn't written in it for weeks, but now finally, he did. "They did not conquer us," he wrote. "They outlasted the need to." He paused, then added one final line, slower this time. "We came as soldiers. We leave as witnesses." Outside, the landscape continued without him. Roads led to places he would never see. Systems hummed without caring who believed in them. The war, he realized, had never required his understanding, only his participation, and now even that was finished. He closed the notebook and slipped it into his coat. There was still one thing he would never be allowed to see. Not the factories, not the command rooms, not the full machinery that had made all of this possible. What he would never see was the moment America decided it would fight this way, the moment it chose systems over symbols, abundance over restraint, regeneration over sacrifice. That decision had been made long before he was captured, long before the first shot was fired. The train rounded a bend, the window filled with light. If this changed how you see the war, not who won, but why, don't keep it to yourself. Someone you know might still be carrying a story handed down without its missing half. And if your grandfather had seen what this man saw from that window, what do you think he would have said?